and welcome to the Pragmatic Product Chat series, where we tackle the biggest challenges facing today's product management, product marketing, and other market and data-driven professionals with some of the best minds in the industry. I'm Rebecca Kalogeris, Vice President of Marketing and Product Strategy at Pragmatic Institute, and your host for this episode. Today, I'm extremely excited to have with us Erin Neal from Klue. Welcome, Erin.
Hello.
All right, Erin, let's give a little context to our listeners. Tell us a little bit about Klue, your role there, and how you got there.
Yeah, awesome. Klue, we're a competitive enablement software solution. So we work with product marketers and other CI leaders in the industry, helping build out their competitive program through our software. We're located in Vancouver, British Columbia, and I'm out of Canada as well, but I'm in Toronto. And I got to Klue through connecting with the CEO about almost 3 years ago when they were a tiny little seed-funded company of about 15 people, 20 people. And yeah, before that, I was at an ed tech company for about nearly 5 years out of Toronto called Top Hat.
As you mentioned, and as I've spent some time with Klue before, Klue really focuses on competitive intelligence, right? And what I think is really interesting is you focus on sales enablement for Klue, and that means also helping internally with competitive intelligence. So you have expertise coming at the topic from both sides. And so I'm really excited to talk to you today about sort of competitive objection handling and how to help ensure our sales partners are armed with what they need to do that well, and for them to have a good idea of what doing it well might look like.
Yes, I'm excited about the topic.
Awesome. All right. So to start with a little, let's talk about when we say competitive objection handling, what are we referring to?
So when we think about competitive objection handling, it's really it's objection handling in general, but when you're up against your competitor. And the way we think about it at Klue is through hierarchy. So we think about it starts with emotion, right? So how are you going to react to that objection through emotion to build trust? And then what is the objective of supporting that objection? And then what's the approaches and tactics that you take? So yeah.
Let's dive into each one, right? So why does emotion matter? When we talk about the first thing to think about is emotion, we are dealing with people in the sales process, even if we're selling in our minds to companies. So emotion is critical. Talk to me a little bit about the emotional aspect of objection handling.
I think emotion comes into play in everyday life and everything you do. And selling is in pretty much everything you do in life, whether it be you are buying your groceries or supporting a software sale. And what we're trying to do here is make a connection and build trust, because a lot of people are emotional buyers. And so the objectives obviously is to, when you are supporting those objections that are coming up, to erase the doubt in their mind, because there clearly is a concern there. That's why they're bringing it up, and shape the lens, maybe something that they haven't thought of before. So perhaps give them another position to think about, to open their mind and broaden their thoughts, and then keep them hooked, right? So in objection handling, I think is amazing, because that means that they're engaged and they're asking thoughtful questions. So if you give them thoughtful answers and keep them engaged, that's only going to build more trust and build a better, hopefully, selling process in your sales approach. And then lastly, I think, oh, sorry, should I stop?
No, I was just gonna add on there, Erin. I think it's interesting that you talked a little bit about emotions and building trust, and two things I think are important. One, you mentioned that if they're bringing up objections, they're engaged, right? If you're not interested at all, you're not trying to elongate the conversation by bringing up objections, right? It's a positive sign. And the other aspect of that, and I think that you could draw on as a salesperson, is there's not just emotions of the person, that you really have your own emotions. When people bring objections, I think it's okay to recognize that, oh, you also have emotions in this conversation. But being able to reposition that from a challenge or an obstacle to, oh, that means they're engaged, helps you also keep your own internal emotions in check.
Yeah, I think you said that really well. I think that, I think it's interesting you say that too, because one of my colleagues was doing a sales process for our HR software, and she said, oh my gosh, it's so difficult dealing with sellers. They were so rude to me or gave me tone when I asked these questions. And she said, of the 5 that she evaluated, 3 of them she dropped instantly because she just didn't have a good connection and didn't feel like they were listening or giving her empathy or positive emotion to build that relationship. So I think you hit it really well there.
Nice.
Keep them hooked. And then the last one I was going to mention is competitive objection handling is being on the offense, right? So we want to make sure that when objections come up, that ultimately they're just opportunities to build further trust and educate your prospect more on why you should or are the better option to choose. So yeah, that's what I think about in terms of the why of emotion and why it's so important.
And I also think one of the things I really like about the hierarchy that you guys talk about at Klue, the objection handling is you recognize that not all objections are the same, right? And you kind of categorize them in 3 different types of competitive objections that you might get, right? Blatantly not true, not entirely true, and it's just plain true. Like that's true. The competitor is better at X, Y, or Z. And I think that's, again, such an important part to do. And if you can talk a little bit about how each of those classifications changes how you might address those objections.
Yeah, it's a funny thing my colleague came up with. It's called the ARR of objection handling and the approaches you take. So when it comes to the truth or not, is it true? Is it not true? Is it somewhat true? We broke it down into 3 buckets. The first is address, the second is reframe, and the third is redirect. And so when it's blatantly not true or not true at all, address. You just need to make sure that you get that out right away. Yes, no, this is why, so that there's no buffer room for interpretation. And I think that that's really important when you think about doing a sales demo or a sales conversation. It's overwhelming talking to a sales rep because they give you so much information. So if you leave any room for interpretation, that could be bad when they go back to their leader or to their boss saying, hey, like, I'm not really sure. They kind of gave me the answer. So that's the first, right? So in terms of approaches of objection handling, if it's blatantly true or blatantly not true, just address it immediately and make sure, of course, you still use positive emotion so that you're not offending them in the question they asked. Any questions on that?
No, but I also think the one nice nuance when we were talking about this beforehand is, it could be that your competitor completely lied about you. Often, though, it's that status has changed, right? It may have used to been true. It's not true anymore. And those are all things that I think you can, again, not only address, but bring up. Yes, that was true in the past, but for the last 3 years, we've done X, Y, or Z, because I think that really shows a depth of how you address it and a bit of a nuance, right? If you just say, no, that's not true. Well, then, but the stories and the facts and the processes that may have changed to make it not true today, I think is a great way of approaching that as well.
I completely agree. And I think one other tactic that I've used is make a joke out of it or laugh about it in the sense that, oh yes, that used to be true, but it changed, over a year ago because we addressed this in the product XYZ, and this is why we addressed it. And I think you said it well, is kind of giving them a little bit more depth of the objection, even if it is blatantly true or not true.
Great. All right. So then there's the one that's like the gray ground, right? It's not entirely true, or maybe it's not relevant in this case. So how would you address that one?
Yeah, so that's the second one in our, ARR framework, which is Reframe. So we want to ensure that we're still answering the objection. I think that's important in any of these approaches, but we're changing the lens through what the prospect sees the situation. So we want to ensure, again, that if they say, like, a good example is trials come up all the time, right? In software or in any kind of purchasing behavior of, oh, can we do a trial? Can we do this? Some companies don't let you do that. Some do, right? So if they don't, you don't want to just say, no, we don't, because then again, they'll leave the meeting and then just go, oh, they can't. And then maybe they'll just stop wanting to talk to you. Whereas if you reframe the conversation and say, hey, why is a trial important to you? Or what are you hoping to achieve? And broaden the conversation around the simple, do you do a trial, objection, or question, then it gives you the opportunity to understand the prospect's needs more and to help go back to the top, address that. What are your thoughts on that? I'm kind of curious in terms of reframing. Sometimes I think people think reframing is avoiding, and that's definitely not what we're wanting to do, but we're wanting to try to broaden the conversation if it's not entirely true.
Yeah. And I think you hit right on the head where that can be troublesome, right? If it feels like you're doing the big Olay, and trying to avoid it doesn't going to go great. But I think one of the things, that can be helpful in, is kind of, digging from them, like, okay, so making sure you understand where that specific concern is, because often those not entirely true ones are like really broad, right? And so if you
Yeah.
can get down a little bit more, like, okay, like where is that concern, or where do you think that's relevant here, it gives you something more easily to decide if it's true or not true, right? Like it helps you figure out how big a issue, quote unquote, this might be. And I think that is sometimes an area to sort of dig down a little bit on, because you're often sort of
Mhm.
fighting against, they're slow. Well, like that's a really broad, right? Are we slow to do paperwork? What kind of slow are we talking about? So I think digging in that one a little bit to figure out where they find the concern in that can be good.
Yeah. And the only other thing I'll say on Reframe is I often consider it too as an opportunity to discuss unconsidered needs. So when
Mm,
you say, oh, they're slow, um, well, what, like, maybe I don't know a good example of that, but why is that so important to you? And are
right.
these other things just as important to you? Have you thought about this? And kind of, yeah, just broadening the conversation around the thing that isn't fully true and whatnot. But yeah, the last one, Rebecca, is redirect, and this is the one where you can get into some muddy water depending on truly how you approach it. And so this is when it's just plain true. So let's say your competitor just lands some huge FUD, and it's true, right? Like, oh, I heard your service was down last month, or oh, I heard you can't do X or Y. What do you do in that situation? And we do want to think of that as redirect. So I would still, again, you always do the A of the ARR, you always address, but you want to make sure that you're redirecting to perhaps more important concepts and topics. So like a good one that comes up all the time is price, right? Like, oh, I heard you're this much money. That's way too much for us. Well, definitely address that. If it's like a complete showstopper, then maybe you shouldn't be having conversations. But maybe redirect the conversation on the value, and maybe the cost won't seem as large once they understand the value more and have thought more about their unconsidered needs coming to the conversation. What do you think about redirect?
I do agree with you. That's a difficult one. I think acknowledge and redirect is a way to make it seem less like you didn't hear them, right? So at least they feel like, I understand your concern about pricing, but
Okay.
like, right. But we offer X, Y, or Z, or whatever other piece. Because I think if you don't acknowledge it, it can feel like they're not heard. And
Yes.
so that's I think a difficult place to be. But a lot of it will depend, on your relationship with them and also your personality. But I like to be like,
Yes.
oh, I heard you there, but how about this?
Yeah. I think I see it in a similar, like, I see address and acknowledge as very kind of interchangeable terms, and I agree with that. And I think when we think about the hierarchy of objection handling, right? And we talked, emotion is always at the top of everything
Mhm.
we do here, right? So all of these all the objectives of, erasing those doubts and shaping the lens and the approaches of the ARR, we always want to bring it back to building the trust. So I completely agree with you. You want to make sure you're acknowledging, addressing, or however you want to define it, because if you don't do that, and you are, yeah, I like what you said about personality. Like, if you're too blunt of a person and the other
Yeah.
person you're speaking to is not, then you kind of have to think about the emotion there and reframe and redirect how you answer.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
absolutely.
yeah.
And you can also, I mean, I think it's the person on the other end is really direct. Then you want to be direct in your response, right? A really wishy redirect or a reframe is not going to be well received by someone who's really direct as well. So it's both sides. That's just keeps it fun, right? You touched a little bit on some tactics and response ideas, and I think it's really great to have sort of like a a quiver full of arrows or ways and phrases that you can like literally have a list of and that you can practice as sort of a bridge, right? Between what their objection is and how you want to answer it. And I know you have a bunch of these, so I would love to hear some of sort of like the response ideas and some of your favorite ways of leading in those objection handling conversations.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to kind of sales enablement and training of making sure that it's accessible to those sellers with these ideas and responses. So making sure that you have different, deliverables or battle cards or accessible content that these sellers can go to when they know they're going into a difficult, competitive objection handling conversation. And so there's so many different, excuse me, there's so many different responses you can have to claims. And Rebecca, of course, it truly depends on what the topic is. But these are just some like simple starting points. Like one could be, I'm not sure what else they told you, but here's the reality. And I think that this one the tone of it can really depend on the person. So I'd be careful with it. But you want to make sure that like you're dismissing what is correct or not correct, but then addressing what is. That's the one that's kind of in the middle when you're reframing. Another one could be, oh, it looks like they have some outdated intel. And I kind of joked about it earlier, like making jokes about things and making a little bit lighter and less maybe intense of a conversation and be like, oh, yeah, no, I think that's out of date, and not necessarily being negative towards your competitor if it's specifically around competitive objection handling. You have to toy a fine line of being rude or dismissive or negative towards your competitor, because that just doesn't, I don't think it really looks good generally.
Yeah. I mean, I think I really like that one. Looks like you have some outdated intel. Like it gives them, like, there's no embarrassment that they're not right. Right. It's not like, oh, how did why'd you think that? It depersonifies it, both their source of where they got it and sort of the right piece. And, and it's sort of lighthearted. I really like that one as a nice ability to transition. And also, again, it does somewhat admit that it was true at one point. And if it was, I think that's a good thing to say. The truth there can only help. But And so that one for me is one of my favorites.
Yeah. And one of my other favorites is, and maybe it's not in this exact, lingo or terminology of that's not what our customers say. I would probably say it in a different form or fashion, but I think this is always a great opportunity to loop in customer stories, right? I think something that sellers across the board, at least at our business, we're constantly working on is bringing in customer stories so that it's relatable and palatable to actual experiences rather than just theory. And so I think it's great if you do have customer examples that can dispute an objection. That will only build your trust more. And then you can always, depending on your use case, even offer that customer, if they're willing to, be a reference. So what are your thoughts on using customer stories in objection handling?
I like it. With you, I would rephrase it, something like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Actually, what we hear from customers is, yeah, exactly. In fact, I can hook you up with one of those customers if you'd like to hear from them directly, so that it doesn't come off combative, but comes off really grounded in market. And the market, in this case, your customer, is sort of a third party opinion. And sometimes when it's my opinion versus my competitor's opinion, like, well, one of us is always right and they're always wrong. But that third party spot, so whether it's a customer or analyst, or if you've got a report or a survey or something like that you can use as a way to position against this, I think is really great. And to your point, Erin, the delivery there can really make it seem much more collaborative.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's hard, like, I have for the listeners, I have a couple examples written out, and it's hard to just say them in context of this, but it really depends on the specific conversation and the tone and the way you deliver. I think one of my other favorite ones is where you say, we see things a bit differently. Here's why. And I think that one's a good like tangible example of that one. Is like, all companies treat support and success differently, right? How are we treated after we sign the dotted line? And perhaps your competitor has a very different approach than yours. So I think that they can be seen as positive or negatives depending on what the client cares about. But to just start the conversation with, oh yes, I think they do that way, that That's awesome. And I think that the value of that is X, Y, Z. We think of things a little bit differently here. We do it because of this, X, Y, Z. And I'm still acknowledging and being positive towards whatever it may be, the topic. But yeah, I like that one as well as a example claim or example response. Sorry.
And a really good way of you're going to hit pretty directly that you don't agree, right? That's the setup on that one. But it is, to your point, it is a politer way of doing it. Oh, the way we see things is different. Here's why, right? It's kind of being like, no, we don't agree with that, but it's done in a way that's both it's not combative and it promises education, right? Like it doesn't just say we don't see it that way, we think it's blue. It's we don't see it that way and here's why, because you're going to educate them on the way you approach that. And so again, I think that's a really good one, and a really good one when you need to hit something pretty direct.
Yeah. And I think that this is, again, another great opportunity to understand the buyer. Meaning that once you kind of say that whole talk track that we just kind of alluded to of we see things differently, here's why, blah, blah, blah. And then then you can say, how do you see things, and really understand what their thoughts are and if it's resonating with them. Because if it's not resonating with them, one of my favorite things to do in objection handling is labeling. Oh, it feels like I didn't hit the mark there. It feels like I didn't fully answer your question. Do you feel whole? Like not whole, but do you feel like I supported you there? Or, I think labeling and calling out if you get that emotional vibe that they're not connecting with what you said, it's very important, right? Because most sellers just, or at least I've seen in most sellers, they just kind of take whatever the prospect says and moves on. Oh yeah, thank you. Okay, cool. Yep, that answered my question. Sometimes it didn't answer their question. And sometimes that objection is still lingering. And that's going to linger after the call. And that might be an impact as to why they not want to continue conversations with you or move forward. So with all of this, I think it's always important after you respond to then label or address that feeling if there's any awkward or negative feeling in the room. It's worked wonders on me, and it's helped build trust, even if it's an awkward thing to do. Some people feel uncomfortable calling out, hey, Rebecca, feels like I didn't answer your question. I kind of laugh about it and usually like, oh, no, it's fine. But have you ever done that before, Rebecca? Like labeling or kind of confirming that they feel whole when you are objection handling? Or I don't know if you, being a marketing leader, if you have to deal with those kind of things a lot.
I mean, I
maybe
think
that as a leader.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yes. And I think here's where I say I don't do it as well as I should. I tend to be like, oh, does that make sense? Right. Which is not the same as, does that address your concern? Which I think in this case, particularly with objections, right, it is a very acute thing. You want to make sure that you get all the way through. I think that callback to say, but let's make sure that answers your questions or your concerns, right? Because like you said, different definitions, different ways. I think it's a really good, strong loop. And I will work to do it better.
Yeah. No, I'm so bad at it too. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Like those are almost like word ticks, like ums and ahs. It's like you want to ask a more open-ended question if possible. And I like, even when I was just giving an example, it was still a closed-ended question. It's hard to perfect that, but it's something I'm constantly working on too.
Yes. So we've talked about the objection handling hierarchy. We've talked about emotions, objectives, approaches, even some ideas of different tactics. I think one of the things that's also important for you and I is like, sure, we in every role in an organization, you deal with objections, but obviously it's our sales partners who deal with them the most acutely. So I think the other question is, how do we arm them to really be ready for those conversations and not to have the information and the approach they need?
It's a really good question. So when we think about arming sales and the people that are supporting them, whether it be marketing or if it's product specific, I think you definitely want to speak to them first, in the sense that you want to understand what their needs are and what are the objections that are coming up the most, especially since the main topic today is around competitive objections. So talking to the sellers themselves first will always be a good starting point, or doing baseline surveys. And then beyond that, building a framework to have those response layouts easily accessible and consumable, right? And whether that be, like I mentioned earlier, a battle card or deliverable or an easy accessible deck or doc somewhere, Depends on, of course, the different technologies you're using at your business, but just making sure that I always think of a couple things, that it's snackable. So it's easy to digest and read and quick to understand, and it's easily accessible. So you want to make sure, consumable and accessible are the two biggest things. And however you deliver that, there's so many different forums and ways you can. My personal favorite as a seller is definitely battle cards, because I like tight, digestible content. I'm not going to read a 5-page document on objection handling or a 10-page document, but if you give me a couple different points to these specific objections that are coming up against this specific competitor, that's going to help me so much in those conversations when it comes up. And even using tools like Gong and getting those snippets from those recordings of when those objections are said, what the seller says and how they react, are really great ways for other sales professionals to see how they react in real time and believe in the actual way that your company is saying you should address that objection. That was a bit long-winded, Rebecca. Apologies for that, but hopefully
no, you gave like 4 really good pieces of advice in there. So let's just like hit them all, right? So one was remember your audience. You called it snackable, which I loved, right? Like they're salespeople, they're moving fast, they need to get to the information fast, and you need to provide that to them in a way where they can do that. So do that.
100%.
2, you mentioned tools. You said use the tools you have. Another huge piece, right? Like it's great. You can be like, oh, I have a really great solution for this, let's say in SharePoint. But if your sales team is in Salesforce, that's a bad place for it to be, right? It needs to be the tools and technologies that are in fact there. So that was the second one. The third one was you talked about Gong, but as an ability to show salespeople how other salespeople are handling it. And I think, again, Erin, super powerful point you made. I can prepare them. I can do like, we can do, we can do like examples and we can do exercises, but a sales to salesperson, a person on the sales team, just has a different authority and a different credibility. And when you can get them to start to share with each other, or when you have someone on the sales team that you work with directly who is kind of trusted within the sales group, I think that can be an even more powerful way sometimes of bringing that down, just because they have the trust of the sales team and they have the understanding and the empathy that I think can really make that powerful.
Was that the third one or the fourth one? I lost track there. Apologies.
I know. See, I always say I should never remember things because I think it was third, and I think the fourth was just talking about evidence, right? Talking about we always want to prove our what we're saying, the why of it, how it's different, those things, and that is something I think we are, particularly in our roles, equipped to do. Is some of that evidence to give them that talking point and bullet points is really strong.
Yes, no, I agree. I think, there's a lot of different things you can take from there. And obviously for the listeners, take whatever's most relevant to your business. But accessible and consumable are 2 huge things. If you're thinking about as a marketer or as a product leader supporting a sales group, those are going to be really important, because if they don't know where to find it, or if it's not easy to get to or read, they're not going to do anything. And it's all your work's going to be for naught, which is the worst thing, right? When you work hard on these different things to support people.
Oh yeah, no, that is the worst. So we talked about a ton of different stuff today, Erin. If you could get our listeners to do 2 things differently tomorrow based on what we talked about today, what would that be?
Good question. Only 2 things. We've talked about so much. No, I'm just joking. I think the first one is it all bubbles up when we talk about this. If you think about a little triangle in the hierarchy, it all bubbles up to emotion. So objection handling is always going to be very important to control the emotion and but to ensure that you're supporting the person you're responding to and using that emotional response to build trust. So that's my first one. I would say just make sure you're always focusing on the emotion to build trust, no matter what the objection is. And then I would say that the second one is just remember the ARR. So when an objection does come up, think about the 3 different tactics you can use. Like, are you going to address it? Are you going to reframe? Are you going to redirect? And how are you going to approach each 3 to still ensure that the emotion and the positive emotions are there to build that trust? those are the two I would say broadly.
And I am also surprised, Erin, that you guys have not coined ARR as the pirate approach, because every time you say it, I think, "Arr," but that's because it was Talk Like a Pirate Day the other day. So you never know.
Oh, well, I just think of when we think of objection handling, we think of salespeople, and salespeople are always going for ARR with their quotas and their goals. So that's what I think of.
Yep.
But I do,
yours works.
I
as
do
well.
like the R. That's awesome. That's awesome.
Oh, awesome. All right. Thank you, Erin. It was an absolute pleasure having you on today.
Thank you so much.
All right. That does it for today's episode. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And don't forget to join us next week when we tackle another great topic designed to help you elevate your product, your company, and your career.